The forest was supposed to be silent. But on the morning of October 2, 1918, the Argonne groaned with the sound of steel and thunder. Artillery shells whistled through the air like banshees, tearing apart trees, earth, and men in equal measure. And in the heart of it all, 700 Americans were about to vanish into history. Major Charles Whittlesey stood over a crumpled map, its edges burned and soaked through with rain. The ink bled into the paper, making the lines of friendly and enemy positions blur together, like the war itself, a chaos of confusion and death. His men, battered, exhausted, and starving, looked to him for answers. But even Whittlesey didn't know where they truly were anymore. They were supposed to be part of a larger push, one of many attacks designed to shatter the German lines. But as the morning fog rolled through the ravine, one simple truth became clear. They were alone. Cut off. Surrounded. And the Germans were closing in. Private Harold Beck, just 19, sat against a fallen tree, clutching his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had stopped feeling hunger 2 days ago. His canteen was empty, his uniform caked in mud and blood, and his mind. His mind was starting to drift. He thought of his mother's kitchen back in Kansas. The way the floorboards creaked when she walked. The smell of cornbread and coffee on Sunday mornings. He'd told her he'd be home by Christmas. He still believed that. He had to. Beck. The shout pulled him back to the present. Sergeant Krotoshinsky crouched beside him, face smeared with dirt. Ammo check. Beck blinked, counting the bullets left in his pouch. 7 rounds. Make them count, the sergeant said. We're not getting resupplied anytime soon. Overhead, the drones of Allied aircraft passed, oblivious to the men trapped below. Somewhere, miles away, headquarters believed Whittlesey's battalion had advanced triumphantly through the German line. They didn't know the forest had swallowed them whole. Major Whittlesey raised his field glasses, scanning the ridges beyond. He could see flashes of German helmets glinting through the trees. Machine gun nests, mortars, and barbed wire all around them. He turned to his adjutant. We hold here, he said firmly. We hold, no matter what comes. In the German trenches, Captain Heinrich Metz peered through his scope. The Americans had dug in deep along a ravine, an impossible position to storm directly. He admired their resolve, even as he ordered their destruction. Surround them, he told his men. Starve them. Burn them out. War, he thought, was not about hate. It was about orders. And both sides were following them to hell. That night, the shelling began again. For hours, the forest lit up in flashes of orange and white, like lightning storms from the underworld. Trees burst into splinters, men were buried alive, and still, Whittlesey refused to surrender. At dawn, runners were sent to break through the lines and deliver messages. None returned. By the 3rd day, the food was gone. By the 4th, the wounded outnumbered the living. Private Beck crawled toward the medic station, a hollowed-out pit lined with moss and corpses. He saw men whispering prayers, some writing letters to families that would never be mailed. And there, in the dirt, he saw something that nearly broke him. A note scratched into a plank of wood. We are still here. He stared at it for a long time. A message to whoever might find them. Proof that they had not given up. On the 5th day, a white sheet fluttered through the trees. It carried a message from the Germans, addressed to Major Whittlesey. A plea, to surrender, to end the suffering. Whittlesey read the paper silently. Then, without a word, he crumpled it and tossed it into the mud. The men watched. And something, some small spark, flickered back to life in their eyes. By the 6th day, their own artillery began shelling them, mistaking their coordinates for the enemy's. Whittlesey's face hardened. He called for his last remaining pigeon, Cher Amy. He tied a desperate note to its leg. We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. As the shells thundered, he threw the pigeon into the air. For a moment, it seemed it would fall, its wing torn by shrapnel. But it rose again, soaring through smoke and flame. Hours later, the shelling stopped. They had been heard. When the relief finally came on the seventh day, barely 200 men stumbled out of the ravine. The rest were dead, missing, or wounded beyond recognition. Major Whittlesey stood among the survivors as medics wrapped the living in blankets. He said nothing. He simply stared into the forest, as though the trees still held the voices of those who didn't make it. Captain Metz, miles away, received word that the Americans had been rescued. He sat in silence. He had done his duty, just as they had done theirs. But for the first time, he wondered what duty truly meant. Private Beck was loaded onto a stretcher, half conscious, his eyes fixed on the grey sky above. He thought he saw something, maybe the pigeon, circling far in the distance. He smiled weakly. They had survived. But no one would ever truly understand what it cost. And in the annals of war, they would forever be known by a simple, haunting name. The Lost Battalion. The forest reeked of smoke, death, and rain. Every breath tasted of gunpowder. Every heartbeat echoed like a drumbeat of survival. By the eighth day, no one remembered what silence felt like. Even when the artillery stopped, even when the sky went still, the ringing in their ears, the ghosts of explosions, never left them. Major Whittlesey crouched inside his shallow command post, a makeshift hole half filled with water. His uniform hung in tatters, his boots soaked through. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights, his voice hoarse from shouting orders no one could hear over the shells. He had always believed in discipline, structure, command, the rules of war. But out here, surrounded by corpses and ghosts, even the rules had begun to rot. He held a letter from his mother in his trembling hand. It had arrived weeks before, when the world still made sense. He'd read it so many times the paper had turned soft, the words barely legible. "We're proud of you, Charles. The neighborhood boys talk about your bravery every Sunday at church." He folded it away. There was no bravery here, only endurance. In the next trench over, Private Beck awoke to the sound of flies. Hundreds of them. They crawled across the bodies of fallen men, buzzing in the damp heat, a living cloud that refused to leave. He brushed one from his face and forced himself to sit up. "Water." The word came from a soldier lying beside him, Corporal Donovan, his voice barely a whisper. Beck looked at his canteen. Empty. He hesitated, then took a strip of cloth, soaked it in the rain puddle beside him, and pressed it to Donovan's lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The corporal looked at him with eyes half-lidded. "You still think we'll make it out?" Beck hesitated. "I have to." Donovan smiled faintly. "Then maybe I will too." That was the kind of faith that kept men alive in the Argonne. Not hope in victory. Hope in each other. By midday, the German lines began to close in again. Mortar fire rained down from the ridges, showering the ravine in shrapnel. Whittlesey stood, straight-backed, as his men scrambled for cover. "Hold the line," he shouted. "Hold it." But the ground beneath them erupted, earth, bone, and blood exploding skyward. A runner fell beside him, his message pouch torn open, letters fluttering like birds into the air. One landed at Whittlesey's feet, a torn scrap written in pencil. "Tell my wife I tried." He clenched his fist and looked to the sky, his jaw tightening. "This has to mean something," he whispered to himself. "It has to." That night, under a shattered moon, the forest burned. Shells had set the treetops alight, turning the ravine into a glowing inferno. The light flickered across the men's faces, hollow, dirty, pale. And then, through the chaos, came a sound none of them expected. Singing. Soft, low, from the other side of the smoke. German voices. At first, the Americans thought it a trick. Then they realized the song was not for taunting. It was a hymn. A voice in English rose up among them. Sergeant Krotoshinsky, tired, bleeding, missing 2 fingers, began to hum along. The others followed. Slowly, painfully, the forest became a chorus of broken men singing through the fire. 2 languages. One melody. For a brief moment, there was no war. Just humanity clinging to a memory of peace. But dawn brought reality crashing back. The Germans attacked from the North Ridge. Whittlesey's men, out of ammunition, fought back with bayonets, rocks, even their bare hands. Private Beck fired his last round and watched his rifle click empty. A figure leaped over the log before him, a young German no older than himself. Their eyes met. Neither moved. For a heartbeat, they simply stared, two frightened boys, trapped in a war started by men who would never set foot in this forest. Then, a shell screamed overhead and detonated nearby, throwing them both to the ground. When Beck opened his eyes again, the German was gone. Only his helmet remained, lying upside down in the mud. By the 10th day, relief forces were still nowhere in sight. The radio crackled occasionally with static, half-sentences, false hope. Whittlesey stopped eating altogether. He gave his rations to the wounded. He was a lawyer before the war. He knew how to argue, how to reason. But there was no reasoning with starvation. Captain Heinrich Metz, from the German side, stood on a ridge overlooking the ravine. He'd lost half his company trying to root the Americans out. He admired their stubbornness but knew it couldn't last. He opened his journal that night and wrote, "The Americans refuse to die quietly. They have no food, no water, yet they fight like the damned. If hell exists, it must look like this forest." He closed the book and lit a cigarette, staring down at the fires flickering below. He almost pitied them. On the 11th day, the rain returned. Thick, cold, relentless. It drenched the trenches, filled the craters, drowned the wounded. But it also brought them one small mercy, water. Beck and two others filled their helmets and passed them along like sacred offerings. Every drop was life. He thought of the German soldier again. Was he alive somewhere out there? He hoped so. Not for war. Not for victory. But for the simple reason that no man deserved to die alone. By the 12th day, movement was spotted to the west, American troops breaking through. At first, no one believed it. Then came the whistles. The shouting. The flags. The Lost Battalion had been found. Whittlesey stood motionless as stretcher-bearers poured into the ravine. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stared ahead as men he'd led, men he'd buried, were carried out one by one. Private Beck was among the rescued, his body thin, his face unrecognizable beneath the dirt. As he was lifted onto a stretcher, he turned his head, looking back at the forest that had swallowed them. He whispered quietly to himself. "We made it." Days later, at a field hospital miles from the front, Beck lay beneath clean sheets for the first time in weeks. A nurse handed him a telegram. It was from his mother. "So proud of you. The newspapers say you're a hero." He turned the paper over, staring at the blank side. Hero. He didn't feel like one. Not after what he'd seen. Not after who he'd lost. He closed his eyes and heard the forest again, the cries, the songs, the silence. And in that silence, he saw the faces of those still there, resting forever beneath the Argonne earth. Major Whittlesey returned home months later. He stood before crowds, medals on his chest, flashbulbs in his face. But behind his eyes, he was still in the ravine. Still hearing the shells. Still counting the names. Years later, he disappeared quietly from a ship bound for Havana. They said it was an accident. But those who knew him understood, some battles never end. And so, history would remember them, the trapped, the forgotten, the unbroken. The men who held their ground when the world forgot them. The Lost Battalion. Their story was not one of victory, but of endurance. Of humanity at its breaking point, refusing to break. And though the forest has long grown back. On certain nights, when the wind blows through the Argonne. Some say you can still hear them. The echoes of the lost. The war was over. At least, that's what the newspapers said. Armistice. Victory. Celebration. But for those who had survived the Argonne, the noise never stopped. In a small ward of an American veterans' hospital, Private Beck sat by the window, watching snow fall across the quiet streets of New York. The world was at peace, yet his hands still trembled. Each flake of snow reminded him of the ash that had fallen from burning trees. Each distant car horn sounded like a shell screaming through the forest. Doctors called it shell shock. Beck called it memory. His roommate, Corporal Donovan, sat on the opposite bed, whittling a small wooden figure. He'd lost 2 fingers in the forest but still managed to carve with precision. "Can't sleep again?" Donovan asked. Beck shook his head. "Too quiet." Donovan smiled weakly. "Funny. We used to pray for quiet." They both laughed, but the sound died quickly. Weeks passed. The city moved on. Parades filled the streets, politicians gave speeches, medals were handed out. But for Whittlesey and his men, the medals meant little. The Lost Battalion had become a legend, printed in headlines, celebrated as heroes. But legends were simple things. The truth wasn't. Whittlesey was invited to every banquet, every ceremony. They put his face on posters, called him a symbol of American courage. But each time he looked into the crowd, he saw ghosts among them, the faces of men who never came home. One evening, after yet another dinner in his honor, he sat alone in his hotel room, his uniform still crisp, his medals gleaming under the dim light. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and unfolded a letter from the War Department. It was a list, the names of every man from the 77th Division confirmed dead. He ran his finger down the page, stopping at familiar ones. Keller, Abrams, Donnelly. Each name was a memory, a voice, a laugh, a sacrifice. The whiskey burned his throat. He folded the paper again, and whispered to the empty room. "I should have been one of them." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Captain Heinrich Metz stood among the ruins of the Argonne Forest. The war had ended, but he had returned, not as a soldier, but as a man searching for meaning. He found the old ravine where the Lost Battalion had made their stand. The trees were blackened, the ground scarred. He knelt beside a broken rifle half buried in the mud and brushed away the dirt. He opened his journal, the same one he'd written in during the siege. On a fresh page, he wrote, "I fought them. I watched them starve, and still they did not surrender. I wonder if I would have had such strength. Perhaps there were no heroes here, only survivors." He closed the book and looked up at the grey sky. The birds had returned. Even the forest heals, he thought. Why can't men? Back in America, Whittlesey withdrew from public life. He moved into a quiet apartment overlooking the Hudson River. Most nights, he sat by the window, staring at the water below. The city glittered with new life, jazz, lights, the hum of progress. But inside, he remained trapped in the Argonne, surrounded by shadows that refused to fade. He kept a box beneath his desk. Inside were letters from the families of his men. Some thanked him. Others blamed him. He read them all, but never replied. Private Beck found work at a shipping company. He smiled when spoken to, worked hard, went to church on Sundays. To the world, he was an ordinary man. But sometimes, while stacking crates, his mind would drift back to that crater, the mud, the hunger, the smell of rain mixing with blood. He'd see Donovan beside him, still carving, still humming that hymn they'd sung with the Germans. That memory brought him peace, and pain in equal measure. One evening, he visited the families of his fallen comrades. A mother opened the door, her eyes wide, searching his face for news she already knew. "You were there?" she asked. "Yes," Beck replied softly. "He was brave. He saved lives." The woman smiled through her tears. "Thank you." As Beck walked away, he realized that sometimes, courage wasn't found on the battlefield, it was in living with the memories that refused to die. Years later, in 1921, the government held a memorial for the war dead. Thousands gathered at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Washington. Whittlesey stood among them, his expression solemn, unreadable. When the ceremony ended, he approached the tomb alone and placed a small wooden carving on the marble, a gift sent to him years ago by Corporal Donovan, a soldier kneeling beside a fallen comrade. He whispered, "You all deserved more than this world gave you." That night, he boarded a ship bound for Cuba. He told the crew he needed rest, needed time away. But in the early morning hours, as the waves rolled quietly beneath the deck, Whittlesey disappeared. The newspapers wrote that he died a hero. But among the survivors of the Lost Battalion, silence followed the news. Donovan, older now and gray, sat in his home in Chicago reading the article. He folded it neatly and placed it inside a box beside his medals. Then he whispered to no one in particular, "Rest easy, Major. You fought enough." Decades later, the forest reclaimed the ravine. Roots broke through the earth where trenches once ran. Wildflowers grew over the bones of men who'd never returned home. A French farmer discovered an old canteen buried near a stream. Inside was a note, water-stained but legible. "To whoever finds this, tell them we held our ground." He placed it in the local museum, labeled simply, "From the Argonne, 1918. Visitors would pass by it every year, reading the short message, never realizing the story behind it, the hunger, the fear, the brotherhood that had held those men together against impossible odds. Private Beck lived long enough to see another war begin. When the radio announced the invasion of Poland in 1939, he turned it off and sat in silence. He looked at a photograph on his wall, his company from the 77th Division, taken before they'd entered the Argonne. Smiling faces. Clean uniforms. Hope in their eyes. He whispered quietly, "We said it was the war to end all wars." He didn't smile. He just stared at the picture as the world prepared to repeat its mistakes. And so the story of the Lost Battalion became legend, simplified in textbooks, dramatized in films, remembered for bravery, but rarely for the suffering that defined it. Yet if you walk through the Argonne Forest today, when the fog is thick and the wind moves through the trees, you can almost hear them, faint voices, the echo of men who refused to surrender, even when forgotten by the world. Their courage was not born of glory, but of desperation. Their heroism was not in victory, but in endurance. They were lost, and yet, through their endurance, found meaning in a world that had none. The Lost Battalion. Not forgotten. Never forgotten.